strangers straight up tried to drown me. This took place about 10 years ago, when I was a freshman in college. This is the first time I've recounted this story, in full detail to anyone. I attend college in a rural mountain area in the Northeast, a small school tucked away in the rolling hills of the mountains. The type of place where the beauty and casual grace of nature is just opposed by the ugliness of humanity. The newspaper was ultra-conservative, and you couldn't sojourn too deeply into the woods beyond a few trees without seeing some type of meth activity. You know the type of place I mean. Anyway, one of my new friends from college discovered somehow an abandoned train trestle deep in the woods about 5 miles from campus, in no man's land basically. I don't remember how he found this place, because it's very much off the beaten path. The trestle crossed above the river, which placidly flowed about 40 feet below. It was usually quiet and beautiful, and we began going there maybe 3 times a week, just chilling on the trestles, watching the water below and the open sky above. We drink 40s there, smoke a bowl there, bring girls there. We began jumping off the trestle into the water below and climbing back up. It was just a very college-y thing to do, our chill spot basically. So one day, just needing to get away from the dorms and away from it all, I decided to go by myself to the trestle for a swim. It was about 7 p.m., so I still had a good hour or so of dim sunlight, and I brought a flashlight for the walk home when it was sure to be dark. I made my trek through the pathways of woods as I had done 100 times before, left my towel and flashlight on the trestle and jumped into the water. The water was about 10 or 15 deep, I'd say. It flowed almost imperceptibly. You might as well be swimming in a stagnant pool. However, maybe about 50 yards away from the trestle, the river narrows and the current picks up significantly. Then about 20 yards after that, there's a maybe 20-foot-high waterfall that bubbles and splashes with extreme violence. We used to watch large objects go over and never come back up again. So there I am, dimly bobbing my head in and out of the water, doing underwater flips, etc. When I pop my head out the water, I happen to glance to the side of the river and see a man walking towards the water. The water is kind of impeding my view, so I don't see him fluidly walking towards the water. I more see him in different stages of being closer to the water. Like flipping through a book. He's 15 feet away, 10 feet away, 5 feet away. I can barely give you a description. Maybe 6 feet tall, pale, skinny, black hair and pulled back in a ponytail. What I do remember the most about his appearance was the extremely empty look in his face and his eyes. Like he was doing something mundane, taking out the trash or raking leaves. I'm treading water, not knowing what to think, and see that he's no longer beside the river. He's dove in, and is swimming pinned straight directly towards me so fast. I try to swim the opposite way, but within a minute I can feel him grab my ankle and tug. I try to scream, but the water filled my mouth. While I'm underwater, he lets go and goes up for air. Then he grabs back on and pulls me again. It seems like he's done this before. I never once see him after he jumped in the water. He's gradually pulling me to where the current picks up before the waterfall. I start to realize this and just fucking flipping out. Kicking, screaming, cursing to no effect. Finally, I can feel the current start to take me, and I twist away towards the waterfall. I look back and see this fucking guy just casually swimming back to where he jumped in the water, not even looking at me. This is by far the scariest moment of my life as I approach the waterfall. Long story short, I go over and I'm underwater for a long time, over a minute. The water above unrelentingly pushing me under. The only reason I survived was there was a large log that had gone over, and I grabbed it and leveraged it against the bottom to push me away from the crushing water. I survived, obviously, but then I had to trek miles back to my dorm, in the dark, without my flashlight. Every step of the way I was thinking he would come back to finish the job. The next year a football player drowned going over that fall. The news said it was because there was an extreme current due to the recent rainfall, but I've always wondered about that. Encounter with a serial killer. First off, this is my first post. I apologize for any faux pas, spelling/grammatical errors. Second, understand that at the time this occurred, I was not living the healthiest of lifestyles. I quit using heroin when I was 25 and moved to France for 5 years. I just recently moved back to the States this past summer. This is relevant because it speaks to my mindset at the time that all this occurred, and why I was comfortable taking the absurd risks I took. I was a drug fiend. Anyway, on to the story. When I was 20, I had moved to Baltimore to the Eastern Shore, thinking the distance would help mitigate my habit. Instead, I just ended up driving to Bmore every couple days and buying several $100s worth of H instead of just buying less on a daily basis. In the process, I got to know a lot of odd people, some of them hacks. In Baltimore, a hack is someone who operates as a cabbie illegally. Often they take people into the city to pick up their drugs or just charge half the rate of a legit cab driver. I had met an older guy at a Dunkin' Donuts on Donewalk who did this. Now, I wasn't in the habit of using hacks, but one night my ride went down a one-way street the wrong way in front of a police officer, and we were pulled over and searched. It ends up the idiot had brought a stash of pot with him, so we were arrested and sent to BCDC. Oh God, I was pissed. Around midnight that night, they released me. It ends up that not only had my friend admitted ownership of the marijuana, but the reason they'd used to search us, that his license was showing up as suspended, was bull. My friend's lawyer had called them on it. So there I was, in the middle of Baltimore City, with no ride, nowhere to go, dope sick, in the middle of December. They released the men and women separately, and my friend's cell phone was still off at the time when I tried to call it. It ends up that he had been released several hours earlier, but had left his phone in the truck. For anyone that hasn't had the pleasure of being arrested, they impound your vehicle. So if you're unlucky enough to get processed and released after 5 p.m. or before 8 a.m., you're out of luck re-getting your vehicle back. Not to mention another couple $100s in the hole. As I mentally ran through the list of options, I remember the hack I'd met earlier that week and decided to give him a try. I figured that at least if he was awake, I could pay him to help me cop and drop me off at the Greyhound bus station to wait out the night. Well, I called, and not only was he up and about, but he was also about a 10-minute drive away from where I was being released. The fact he was still up and about at 1 a.m. may have given normal people pause. I just assumed he was probably a crackhead, tweaker, or some such, and wrote it off as luck. Within a half hour, he showed up, and I clambered onto the long gray sedan, just grateful to be out of the cold and back on solid ground. Now, to give you an idea of the way this guy came off, the best way I can think to describe him is gray. Everything about him was just gray. His vehicle was a medium dinged up gray. His hair was longish and a deep solid gray. Even his parlor seemed gray. I remember he had the face of a postmenopausal woman, sort of jokingly if you know what I mean. Soft. In retrospect, the guy was creepy as all get out, but at the time he just seemed unexceptional. And really in the drug world, there are so many weird people that you're forced to deal with on a daily basis that unless you're someone that comes off blatantly hostile, you eventually learn to just ignore the crazy. If you don't, you'll drown in it. We managed to cop in Baltimore. There's always someone out. I asked the guy to take me to the Greyhound station, just wanting to get well and curl up till I could think of catching a bus. He just sort of looked at me, looked down, looked back up, then asked if I wanted to just come watch TV at his place, till the buses began running. Looking back, I remember feeling a bit hesitant, but the man seemed so unexceptional, such a non-entity that I couldn't imagine him being a threat. And if I'm entirely honest, I just wanted a clean, warm place to get it on. I was well beyond dope sick at this point, and all my consuming thought was just to get straight. Taking my silence for hesitation, I remember him telling me not to worry, that he wasn't going to try anything. I probably should have mentioned that I'm a 5'6", 100-pound female, 20 years old at the time, and that the bus station wasn't really the safest place for a tiny female like myself to be hanging out at 2 o'clock in the morning. That he was just trying to help. Well, F me, but I thanked him and said sure, and we proceeded to drive out towards the county. To this day, I'm still not sure what direction we'd gone in. Just that wherever it was that he lived, it was about half an hour outside the city, and that it was not in the woods, but in a heavily wooded area. As we neared his house, he started acting a bit strange. Not enough to set off the alarm bells, yet, but still. I'll never forget him saying that either the police chief of that county or the chief's son lived in the same cul-de-sac as he did, that they were friends, and that the guy had helped him out of whatever he termed as a few predicaments. The house was right on the lake, with a dock in the backyard. I have no idea what county this was, and no one I've tried describing it to has ever been able to pinpoint it either. It was totally alien to me. We pulled into his driveway, and I was shocked to see that his house was closer to being a McMansion than the hovel I'd assumed I was in for. He would go on to tell me, as he parked up and walked up to the door, that it all belonged to his mother, who had recently passed away. Here's this ratty little man with a ratty little car and an extremely, well, Not nice, but expensive house. Driving around all day and night for pocket change, and basically living at a Dunkin' Donuts. I was more than a bit skeptical. When we went inside, the situation became even stranger, but at least more familiar, more in line with what I'd seen of that guy so far. The house was covered in two things: dust and knickknacks. And when I say covered, I mean covered. Every square inch of surface space was covered with tacky little porcelain angels and dollar store crap. Shelves, tables, the top of the ginormous old box television. Even the kitchen was covered in them. The kitchen itself I only saw for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how even the sink was filled with things. There were the obligatory doilies that old people seem to have in spades, all of them covered in dust and discolored. I asked where the bathroom was, and excused myself to go get high. I was getting pretty weirded out by this point. I just wanted to get straight so I could decide what to do. I did my thing and went back to the living room, which was the first room you walked into when you came in the door. Didn't want to go any deeper into the house. I wanted to take a look at the lock on the door, create an exit strategy, and hope I didn't really need one. That hope was quickly dashed. The first thing the guy did was bring me a glass of water and a handful of pills. Puzzled, I asked him what the pills were for. He said, to sleep. Now it's 3 a.m. at this point. I have to be at the bus station by 6. At most, we have maybe 2 hours before we will have to leave. I tell him I don't think that's a great idea, since falling asleep isn't on the agenda, that we don't even have time for a quick nap. Well, he starts to become pretty insistent that I take the pills. Believe me, if I weren't so out in the middle of nowhere, not to mention it being December, and the bitter, bitter cold at this point I'd have booked. Instead, I sort of laughed and took 2 of the pills out of his hand, stuck them in my mouth and took a sip of water, saying, well, what the hell? Immediately he brightened and shuffled off to get me another glass of water, which I'd requested. Looking back, I shouldn't have even drank the bloody water. Idiot. I spit out the pills and shoved them in the seat of the sofa. The whole time we've been talking about little things. Baltimore, local politics, music, nothing deep. At this point, he starts asking me about chemicals, about drugs. Specifically, what sort of drugs will knock someone out, but not harm them? How much would you need of what for someone to say, tiny like myself? I try to act as if it's entirely normal conversation fodder. At this point, it seemed to me that my existence depended on me not registering how abnormal the entire situation was. I think my thought process at the time, and especially as time went on, you'll see what I mean shortly, was that I couldn't react as if I knew what was going on, that I couldn't act as if there was anything strange or alarming occurring, that he would be stupid to let me leave and let me live if he knew that I knew exactly what was going on here, that I need to seem like a non-threat. The whole time we are having this discussion, by the way, the guy kept trying to get behind me. At one point he succeeded, started rubbing my shoulders. I just laughed and said I wasn't a fan of massages, that I needed to run to the bathroom. When I came back, I made sure to sit on the sofa that was up against the wall. I'm looking around for a phone, but I don't want to ask for one, because I don't want him to know that my cell phone is dead. Yeah, another great stroke of luck. My cell phone had died 5 minutes after I called the creep to come pick me up. Now, this whole time the guy has been pacing around the living room, sitting for a few minutes only to get back up again, walk back and forth for a bit, and sit back down. He began talking about his mother, how she collected all these knickknacks, how she died, heart attack, and how he'd been thinking about renovating the house, but hadn't had the heart to make any changes to anything yet. So he says he wants to show me something. He wants to show me the upstairs. Why I didn't run screaming out of that place, I didn't know. I think part of me was still very much hoping that I was misreading the situation, that the guy was just lonely and creepy and socially maladapted, not actually dangerous or anything. But here we have yet one more horror film trope coming into play. Creepy obsession with mother, and bizarre dust-filled house, perfectly preserved in memory of mom, down to the last glass she used sitting on the kitchen table. I knew not. Now the guy wants to show me the upstairs. He wants to show me her room. So I follow him up the stairs. At first he makes it obvious he wants me to go up before him, but I wasn't having any of that. We get to the second story. There were 3, never made it to the third, however, and turns off down this hallway. He opens the first door on the left, goes in, and I'm half expecting to see the body of his dead mom lying on the bed or something, and find myself seriously relieved when I find myself standing in just one more dust-coated room full of crap. I don't remember much about the room. I remember the bed was made, and I couldn't tell if the comforter was dark or just covered in so much dust that it appeared that way. He gestured for me to sit down. I blanked. What followed was the worst of the experience. He sat down on the end of the bed next to me and began talking about his mother. After a bit, he looked at me and said, "You're so beautiful. You look like a little girl. I bet little girls really like you." Tried to lead the conversation back to his mom. He gets up and walks down over to the far wall of the bedroom, starts referring to our earlier conversation about drugs and knocking someone out. He asked me what I would use to knock out a child, what I would use to keep a child knocked out for long periods of time, safely. I'm trying at this point to act as if I'm still on point, as if I'm not finding this line of conversation to be dreadful, creepy, and horrible. I tell him I really don't know. I'm just a dope fiend, not a chemist. He asks about and if it would be safe. At this point, I've just done it, and I think he can tell. He says, "I want to show you something." I begin to protest and tell him that I have to use the restroom, but he insists. He pushes on the cheap wood paneling on the wall, and a large square of it swings open. He gestures inside, says he's been working on it for a few years, and that it's just big enough for a small woman, but made for a child. It's a sort of cot, and there are loops on the ends, for rope, or some restraint, I'm sure. I noped out of the bedroom down the stairs. I didn't run. I just told him I had to go to the restroom again. While I was walking, shaking down the stairs, I pulled my cell phone out of my purse and mimicked dialing on it. I was lucky that he stayed behind to close up the bedroom and that thing in the wall, so he didn't see that my phone wasn't even turning on. I pretended to be having a conversation with a friend of mine, and at the point that he showed up, began loudly recounting what had transpired that evening to my friend. I told him how I'd called the nice gent we had met at the Dunkin' Donuts to come pick me up, that I was at the guy's house, but I'd be leaving shortly. I then pretended that my friend had offered to come pick me up from the bus stop, and in one respect, I was lucky. The guy knew I was leaving out of town, but he didn't know I was leaving 4 hours away, or that I had any friend of mine that would have to make the hellishly long trip if they were to come pick me up. I told my friend that I was heading out to the bus station ASAP, and that I'd see him soon. I still remember the look on the guy's face as I said that. It darkened. You know that look that snotty, spoiled little kids get when someone actually dares to tell them no? It was like that. It was that look, but worse. Because there was something almost perverse about seeing it so openly displayed on the face of a 50-something-year-old man. So I started to grab my purse, zip up my coat, all the while gibbering about how my friend remembered him and had said to tell him hi. It seemed at the time that there were two things that were at the utmost importance at that moment. The first, to make him feel that I hadn't found him or anything he had said or displayed odd, or didn't want him to think I would be some sort of threat to his plans or well-being if he let me leave. Secondly, I wanted him to know that he was identifiable, and that someone, at least someone who could identify him, knew I was with him. That's pretty much the end of the story, although I had one more, far worse encounter with the same guy a couple weeks after this incident. He took me to the bus station and acted the entire time we were driving there. The second encounter convinced me that not only was I lucky to be alive, but that I had spent several hours in the home of a serial killer. Do I think he had done anything yet at the time I spent the terrifying early morning at his home? No. I think he was gearing up to, though. By the second brief encounter I had with the guy, I'm positive he was. I don't know how to put it. That uncertainty he displayed with me was so gone. I think at that point, he'd crossed the line. If I haven't bored everyone to death and anyone wants to hear about the second encounter, I'll post it. In closing, I will say this. I did take down his license number as he was leaving that morning, and I did contact a friend of mine who was a police officer. A year or so after all this happened, my friend called me and asked if I still had the guy's information. He lost it, if he'd ever even really bothered to write it down at all, and there had been several disappearances of young children in the very same areas that the guy, in our second blissfully brief encounter, mentioned that he had trolled, just scoping out the little girls. I did try to find the man. I began by going to the Dunkin' that he had hung out at. The owner, who said the guy had spent every single morning there for a couple years, told me that he had just quit coming the same week that this happened, and I think I finally figured out why he hung out there every morning. The day I went there looking for the guy, I noticed that there was a bus stop in front of the Dunkin', a bus stop full of elementary school kids. After my initial encounter with the Dundalk creep, I contacted a friend of mine who was a Baltimore City police officer, gave him a description of the creep's house, car, his license number, first name, cell number, and a detailed account of what transpired that morning in his home. A year or so later, I would receive a call from the very same officer, asking if I still had a record of the info I'd given him. Unfortunately, I no longer did. And the owner of the Dunkin' Donuts on Eastern Avenue had no information on the creep. The last he'd seen of him, the creep had come by to show him a car he'd purchased. It was black, and a sedan, but that was all the owner knew. I was on high alert for a week or so. I'd receive a couple of sketchy calls from a blocked number, but nothing I could pin on the creep. Life went back to normal, my normal at least. And after a couple of weeks, I was able to convince myself that I had exaggerated the entire encounter. After all, I was still breathing. So one day, Tom and I decided to take a trip to the city to pick up my stash for the next few days. Usually, when we went up to Baltimore, we pick up about $500-$600 worth of scramble, 70 pills, ILW. This would last the two of us about 2 days, sometimes 3. I had a hell of a habit. Well, this particular day, we decided to pick up a bit more than usual. Why? I can't remember. But the entire trip was cursed from the get. We were late leaving the shore. There was an accident in the harbor tunnel that ended up backing up traffic for a good 3 hours. And by the time we made it to East Beemore, my contact had dipped. I ended up getting in touch with another guy who sold out of Dundalk. So we went down to Erdman Avenue, the same Erdman Avenue the creep's Dunkin' Donuts is on. And I had Tom park in a Goodwill parking lot so that I could go find my guy. Most of my contacts knew Tom, but this guy I was going to meet was one of those paranoid hitters. And it wouldn't serve me if he saw Tom's truck in the vicinity of where we were meeting. So I had to hoof it. I can't remember exactly where it was that he wanted me to meet him, but I'm fairly certain it was on Dundalk Avenue, or Merritt Boulevard, one of those large roads that run through Dundalk like a vein. Whenever I'm in the city and I have to walk anywhere, I employ the look down, look at your feet, never look a stranger in the eye. If a car honks their horn at you, do not respond method of minding my own business. A large part of the reason I do this, the unspoken reason, because a lot of people assume that you're a hooker if they see you walking. Generally, if you don't respond when they honk their horns and holler at you, after a bit they'll leave you alone. And don't forget the police and the undercovers. It's their job to harass you a bit and to see if you respond, to see if you're doing business or merely an unlucky member of a vehicle-less tier of society. On this particular day, I remember being more than a little spooked at the absence of traffic. It wasn't a nice day. It was overcast, gray, a standard January afternoon in Baltimore, but it wasn't abnormally either. There was certainly no reason for it to be so quiet. I was walking down one of Dundalk's larger roads. Traffic should have been steady. There should have been a few people shopping and walking about, at least. But no, it was just me and the occasional ragtag car. I was a mile down the road from my meeting point with my dealer when a black sedan pulled up next to me. It was the creep. He opened the passenger side door from the inside and told me to get in. Now, I seriously considered altering the story at this point to make myself look and feel like less of a... But so far, I've been entirely honest in my retelling of the encounters with this guy, so I'm not going to start lying now. Anyway, please cut me some slack. Over the 3 or 4 weeks that had passed since the incident at the creep's house, I had spent a fair amount of time talking myself into believing that I had over-dramatized the whole encounter, that maybe the little room in the wall and the cot hadn't been what I thought it was. In short, I had tried to convince myself that I was just a heroin-addled junkie who had blurred the line between reality and fantasy. So when the creep pulled up and told me to get in his car, there were a lot of reasons why I did just that. Instead of doing what a sane person would and start screaming, running, and pitching a fit and just generally noping the hell out of there, I tried to figure out why I did what I did that day. All I can say is, between having convinced myself that there was no way I'd actually experienced what I thought I had, and my dislike at the feeling that I had been a giant coward, I felt sort of compelled to face the guy and verify that, no, there was nothing strange going on, and that it really had all been in my head. At the same time, there was another dynamic at play. The fact that I was still sickeningly afraid of that creep. I remember pulling back from the open door of the car, looking around, looking at the whole lot of no one and nothing on that street, and thinking that if I didn't go willingly, he could easily run me down on his own. I told him I was busy, that I was on my way to meet my guy, and he said that was fine. He'd take me the rest of the way and drop me off, that he'd even take me back to wherever I was going afterwards, if I wanted him to. So I got in the car. I was terrified, and I fell back into the same routine I'd utilized the first time around. acting disoriented, high, harmless, and glad to see him. I asked him what he'd been up to. He said, in perfect monotone, that he had tried to call me. Why I hadn't answered, I explained that I used throwaway cell phones, that I had acquired a new one once my minutes had run out on the other phone. Remember I said that I had only been about a mile or less from the meeting point with my dealer when the creep pulled up? My hopes were pinned on him keeping his word and actually taking me where I needed to go. If that happened, I thought that everything was okay. I didn't need to worry. But of course it didn't. When he blew through the light we needed to turn at, I told him he'd missed my stop. "Oh," he replied, "don't worry. I'll take you where you need to go. I just wanted to talk to you for a minute first." I just felt sick to my stomach, and I could see that he was turning into one of those little parks they have dotted throughout the city. Parks with jogging pads and a few token toys and swings for children. If I recall correctly, there was some sort of school or government building in the background. I remember thinking that as soon as he slowed down just a bit, I was going to jump out of that car. I also remember thinking that I needed to relax, that if he even thought for a moment that I was beginning to freak out, my chances of him slowing down or giving me any sort of out would be nil. You see, the whole time I was sitting there looking at the door lock, the area we were in, etc., he was going on about how he'd been looking up sedatives, and he wanted to get some Xanax and some benzodiazepines, how he'd really like my help, and how he'd been scouting out the park where we were at the moment, as well as other parks throughout the city and county, and how he was certain that someone like me by his side would help lure little girls back to his house. He could fulfill his dream, he said. And here's what terrified me the most: that he could use the dock behind his house to get rid of the bodies. I never disliked myself more than I did that day. The whole time he had been talking about all this, I'd been doing two things. One, I had begun to slouch down in the passenger seat with my eyes almost shut, trying to act as if I had nodded out. I could only see him a little out of the slit corner of my eye. The whole time he was talking about all this, he had been rooting around under the front of his seat, slowly, sneakily, as if he was trying not to make any noise, you know? So when I would respond to him now, I would make a warning gesture, like move your hand, to indicate that I was about to open my eyes. The last thing I wanted to do was make him feel like he had been caught, and that he had to pull whatever it was out immediately. The second thing I had been doing was how I was responding to his questions. Instead of acting freaked out or upset, I was trying to act like I was on board with all this, but not too on board. I was trying to act like I was considering it, like I had the option to do this if I wanted to or not. I didn't want him to think of me as some victim, and I didn't want him to think that I was thinking of myself as a victim. I was hoping that if I had acted like his peer, like a potential partner in crime, that he would treat me like one, or at least pretend to long enough for me to get out of the car safely. He was still circling the little park when he began to slow down significantly. Through this slim opening of my eye, through my eyelashes, I could see him reach as far down as he could under the front seat, all while watching me intently to see if I'd move. I knew it was the time to get the hell out of Dodge, because whatever he had, whatever it was he was looking for down there, he did not want me to know about it. That terrified me. And God, was I lucky. I was lucky because at the same time he was slowing down, another car had come out of nowhere and was slowing down next to his vehicle. He sat up. I bolted. Just grabbed the door handle, fell out of the door, and ran without ever looking back once. I pulled my cell phone out of my purse and called my friend. I had him pick me up from one of the stores on the corner of the avenue. I was bawling, terrified at my own stupidity, at how close I knew I had come to ending up in some psycho's dungeon. This is how he referred to his hole in the wall during his rant that day. All because I didn't want to listen to my instincts, or hell, just pure common sense. I cried and cried and cried thinking about that creep and the things he said he wanted to do to little girls. This is, for all intents and purposes, the end of my encounter with the Dundalk creep. About 2 or 3 months after all this had happened, I received a phone call one day. One I didn't answer because the number was unfamiliar. Later the same week, I checked my voicemail, and it was the creep. He had changed his number and wanted to let me know. And also he had finished renovating the house. He wanted me to come see it. He said he put an ad in some paper and was letting out various rooms as boarding houses to women only, and that he had some interesting ideas he wanted to talk over with me. I forwarded his new number to my police officer friend and changed my own. Despite what I said earlier, when I had told the creep that my number had changed because I used throwaway phones, my number had never changed. I just never answered numbers I didn't know, and prior to our second meeting had not bothered to set up my voicemail at that point in time. To anyone out there interested in pursuing this, Over the years, I've tried off and on to find the creep's house. Now, at least with Google Maps, I may be able to narrow down the county. The Dunkin' Donuts he hung out at every morning for years is the one on Erdman Avenue. Google Maps shows the DD with the bus stop out front, for anyone that's interested in checking it out. And I still think the best bet is the owner of that Dunkin'. Creep hung out there for years, picking up business, drinking coffee, and talking to the owner. I refuse to believe that they didn't know each other a bit better than the owner made out, or that the creep just never showed up there again. I can believe that he may have cooled it with that place for a bit after our encounter, but I think it's almost a given that he'd have gone back eventually. The only other possible point of identification I can think of is the cop the creep claimed lived in the same cul-de-sac that he did. He said it was either the police chief of that county or the chief's son. I remember him seeming to find that amusing, that he laughed about his friendship with the cop. But they were on the river. The cul-de-sac had to be accessed via a bridge on the main road. Beyond this recollection, I'm tapped. Let me know which story was your favorite in the comments. And as always, thank you for listening. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more stories like this. See you next time.